And our speaker this evening is Professor Patrick Hunt. Patrick has given us several wonderful talks in the past, and many of you will remember the fabulous tour he gave us of the Byzantine-style mosaics in the Greek Orthodox Church in Belmont. Patrick also teaches for Stanford's Continuing Studies program, and I can highly recommend his classes. Maybe he can tell us what he's teaching this quarter and what he's teaching next. The title of his talk for this evening is The Marvels of the Alhambra of Granada. So we're in for a real treat. Thank you for coming, Patrick. It's all yours.
It's a pleasure to be with you all again. I recognize quite a few familiar faces, and it's a pleasure and honor to be able to share something I love. Before I actually share my screen, I'm going to hold up just a few things. I'm sure you've all been to the Alhambra, but if you go to the Alhambra and go to the palace of Charles V, the round sort of protuberance that now dominates much of the site, you can get these beautiful balat tiles. They're replicas, of course, but they come in different sizes and shapes, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Also, because I have just returned from a trip abroad, I'm going to be showing you some real Zelish tiles, and I'll talk more about this shortly, but you can see that it is a copper-based, what we'll call a glaze, over terracotta, and pretty high-fired. But I'll come back to that. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen in a minute. But before I do, there are great books on the Alhambra. This one by Mondatore Editore in Italy, and Desmond Stewart, whom you may know from his other great nonfiction books, wrote that, and very sympathetic to the Moors. And then, of course, everybody here, I'm sure, knows Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. And I'll read just a very brief excerpt from that when we get to the context of the Torre de las Infantas. Having been to the Alhambra many times, it never ceases to amaze me. And it is clearly one of the greatest treasures of the world. But this is where I was 2 weeks ago in the Sahara Desert, in a desert camp tent, looking at some of the desertification of the Sahara, where much of the Moorish art derives. And I was in Morocco on the border of Algeria, and that's where I was able to, also when I was at some medieval sites, that's where I picked up this Zelish tile that I showed you before. But as you know, in Morocco, the Moors are the source of much of what we see at the Alhambra today. And I was also in Fez, many places, and I was at a Zelish tile workshop, and these are the craftspersons who are still making these tiles. So if you know the tiles, the Zelish tiles of the Alhambra, the craft endures today. So more of that to come. So if we talk about this land, remember that Spain at the time was mostly, if you think of Al-Andalus, that is Spain under the Moors from essentially the 8th century as they shrunk with the Reconquista further and further to the south of Spain until you came to the Emirate of Granada from the 13th to the 15th century. That was about all that was left. But Granada was probably not just the heart of much of what was Moorish in Al-Andalus, but it was the last gasp of the Moors there. And as you know, when the Visigoths accidentally tried to get help to overthrow one of their basically contenders, Tariq and others came across. And remember, Tariq is the source of the name, the Moors that came with Abdurrahman and so on in the early 8th century, 711 onward, and conquered Iberia. And of course, many different periods of expansion, but Islam had arrived in Spain literally by the early 8th century and stayed there till 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella, although the Muslims were tolerated for a little bit longer than that. But essentially, that was the fall of the Nasrid Emirate and the fall of Granada to the Spanish Reconquista. And this is essentially, when you think about what it looked like up against the Pyrenees, Al-Andalus, with many of those famous cities. If you've been and seen the material also in Cordoba, which was Cortuba, as well, and Saragossa and others, you can see, for example, Seville was very much a Moorish site. Or if you can you see my cursor moving around? Someone just say yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And Seville was the place where conquered, considerably before Granada, as was Cordoba. The original Caliphate of Cordoba controlled much of Al-Andalus until the 11th century. And then the Reconquista moved further and further south and pushed the Emirate of Granada, the Nasrid dynasty, into the corner where the Sierra Madres are. So this is the Caliphate of Cordoba into the 11th century, as the kingdoms in the north, the Christian kingdoms, first with the help of the Carolingians, moving further and further south, taking Spain bit by bit. And the Caliphate of Cordoba lasted until the 11th century. And then you had two other dynasties come in that were Moorish as well. And this is Cordoba. I'm sure you've all been and seen the great mosque cathedral there. I'll pass over it very quickly. One of the, I think, wonders of the world. But here's some terms that I think would be useful. We're not going to cover all these terms, but some of them are very important. We're going to see, for example, right at the top, oblak is alternating type of stonework. If you think of some of the Florentine alternating colors, it's very likely that alternating colors derived from early Islamic coloration. And Alcazar is a palace complex. You also have Alcazaba, which is a fortress complex, and that's really Alcazaba can have an Alcazar in it. The word Qasar in modern sort of Moroccan dialect Arabic means a palace, so it's just CSAR. But Alcazaba is what the Alhambra started as, and then it also became a Qasar. Some of these terms that you can see here, there's a lot of decoration in Islamic art because of the anti-iconic principle. So geometry rules, and you are not really supposed to have in the Sunni faith of Islam, you're not supposed to have figuration. In the Shia, if you've been to Iran, you see that the Shia, particularly the Safavids, allowed a lot of figuration even on their carpets until the modern Iranian Islamic revolution of the mullahs. Now it's frowned upon to have iconic figuration of animals and humans, etc. But the geometrical wonders that you will see tonight are part of that move towards mathematical imagination that really is dominant in Islamic art. Just a few other terms. Atarik is an abstract vegetal decoration in arabesque. We'll see that in the tiles. A balat is a tile that I just showed you. This is a balat, and a perfect tile, because of the geometry, is called balat mitalium. And there are a lot of other patterns that we're going to see. There's another type of stucco pattern called giri, Girih. There are sometimes window screens if they're pierced with stone piercings. That's from India, that word. But if they're lattice window screens of wood, that's called masharabia. And of course, that's also a type of marquetry of wood tarsi inlaid that is very important in Islamic art. And it was important in Al-Andalus. It's still important in Morocco. It's important all over the Islamic world and the craftspersons there. Medina is a market. We're only going to see a bit of that. Much of this is not so important, but notice down in the M's in the middle, when you have Christian art under Muslim rule, and you can also borrow some motifs, but when you have Muslim style under Christian rule, that's called mudehar, and the best place to see that in the world is probably Seville, also Toledo, a little bit also in Zaragoza, but Seville is probably the best place to see the adoption of Muslim style in buildings that were built under the Christian Reconquista. One of the most important words here is mukarna. That's the next word down, which is a honeycomb stalactite type of decoration. We'll see that. And I think those are the most important terms, although inlaid wood marquetry, particularly in the ceilings that we'll see at the Alhambra, we talk about intarsa or intarsated today, borrowing that Arabic word. And then the last word there is zellige, which is the ceramic tile, which you're going to see a lot of tonight. And in Spain, it was changed and painted where you have the sort of dominant blue color of the cobalt called azulejos. But these are primarily the terms that we're going to look at tonight. I think the vocabulary, the glossary is important. Now, just looking at different types of arches, a horseshoe arch, which is a very important arch coming out of the Islamic world, it's called a hudwat arch. You can see it here in this particular gate, and this one's in Cordoba, but you can also see overlapping horseshoe arches. This is a quatrefoil. You can actually see 4 arches, and some say that some of the Gothic arches are made from the Islamic model with overlapping arches. If you take overlapping semicircles, you can sort of create the type of what we will call a Gothic arch, but it's not necessarily in a horseshoe arch as you see here. And then you also see different tile carved and otherwise details. This is that sort of a block alternating colors, but done in brick and stucco. And again, you can see these overlapping arches here with the decorations. And then notice you also have up at the top above the windows what are called cusped or scalloped or polyfoil arches. And these are just things that you will see all over the Islamic world, not just in Morocco and in Spain. As I mentioned, one of the wonders of the, I think, cultural world is the hypostyle hall of 1,000 columns there at Cordoba. And while we don't see that at Granada, one of the most interesting things is that mosque in Cordoba, as you know, had a cathedral built into it after Reconquista, after the 12th century, and it literally happened even later than that. It happened more into the Renaissance, but this it hasn't survived so well as Granada has. So Cordoba has its cathedral mosque and a few other things, Medina, et cetera, a little bit else, but not so much as Granada has. Now, here is a mihrab, which is a prayer niche, and that little rectangular or squared edge with, as you can see here, Islamic script in it, Quranic verses, etc. This is called an alfiz, and it's always pointed to the east on what we call the Qibla, the direction of Mecca. So you'll see that, unfortunately, at Granada, at the Alhambra, that mosque was destroyed. And now you have the Church of St. Mary over the spot. Now, after the Caliphate of Cordoba, you had several different empires that came in from Morocco. And here you can see the Almohad Empire, which was Moorish, and it controlled southern Spain at that time. Still, Al-Andalus was shrinking by that time. And the tile, this tile that I showed you right here, comes from this area around Sijil Masa, and I was given it to examine for its chemistry. And the Zelish tile factory that I went to was in Fez. This is what the Almohad dynasty is named after, Al-Muwahhidun, those professing the unity of God, and that's their pennant. But now here's a main focus tonight is the Nasrid kingdom from basically the middle of the 13th century to 1492. So the Emirate of Granada, and you can see the dates of the Reconquista as each of these cities fell to the Spanish Christians. And here are the quarters of the Emirate, Bayana, Elvira, Tucarana, and so on. And notice down here, Malaga, all the tiles that I'll show you tonight were made in Malaga. And I was there last year in Malaga, looking at the Phoenician to Punic to Roman to Visigoth, and then, of course, to the Moorish influences in Malaga. Now, this is the pennant of Granada. And its phrase, there is no victor but Allah. That's what that says here. There is no victor but Allah. Wala galiba ila. But you can see a little bit of Mozarabic influence here, and that the Nasrids took that same phrase, their war cry, and they put it in a European scudo, a European heraldic shield. So that's sort of that influence of the Christians upon Granada, because by the time the Nasrids take over as the sultans and emirs, there's already a strong interpenetration between the Christian culture and the Islamic culture. So there was a lot of borrowing back and forth. To a certain degree, Granada reflects a little sort of a stalemate, as well as sometimes even semi-vassalage. But Granada stayed very rich because of its contact with the gold of Africa until 1415, until the early 15th century. Granada was able to survive because of the vast gold resources it was receiving from Africa. And here's the sultans of the dynasty in question who built the Alhambra, starting with Yusuf, and then Muhammad I, who was called the Red. He apparently had red hair, like Fatima, if you think of the family of Muhammad. And that's important because Al-Hamar means the red, so that'll come back to us. But some of the dynasties that created the Alhambra, the early phases in the 13th and early 14th century. We'll talk a little bit about Yusuf III in the early 15th century, and then we'll look at the last ruler, Boabdil Muhammad XII. Now, this is what you see today if you're looking from the old Moorish quarter across the hill. If you're looking from sort of the northeast down to the Alhambra or across to it from the opposite hill. And this, by the way, this huge agglomeration is a square building with an internal round courtyard and peristyle, and that's the Palace of Charles V. So we're going to ignore that, and we'll instead spend a lot of time on the Moorish material. All the things that you see other than that, and you will see there's the church that's built over the mosque. That's on the opposite side of this archaeological and cultural park. But this was the original name, Al-Qala al-Alhambra. And Alhambra means, so the main name for the Alhambra is we can call it the Spanification of the Arabic. So Alhambra means the red. So Al-Qala Alhambra is a term for essentially the red fortress. The walls were very much reddish, and some of that was the iron oxide and the stucco, et cetera, the plaster. But it also glowed in the sunset. And as you probably know, if you've been to Marrakesh in Morocco, it's mandated that the buildings there also be sort of that iron oxide and manganese red stucco. So red cities like Marrakesh and the Alhambra as a fortress palace complex were very important in Moorish art and aesthetics. So the Muhammad I, who was called the Red because of his red hair, that's probably also some etymological origin of the name, the Alhambra, even though it's meant for a long time, at least since the Christian period that took it over, certainly by the 15th century, it was already called the Red Fortress, the Alhambra. Here's the basic plan, and we're going to go into much more detail. You can see the fortress, the original fortress, and that's what you still see today as the Alcazaba, the fortress. This is a park. Everything you see in gray is the Granada Archaeological Park. And there are many, many gardens here. But the main palace that we're going to see tonight is the Nazarias. That's the Nazarid Palace. Nazarias is the Spanish word for the Nazarids. This is Charles V's agglomeration that stuck there, essentially after 1500. Basically, 1520s onward, with the huge circular courtyard and periptery and colonnade. But this is primarily what we're going to look at. And there are different phases from Yusuf I, Yusuf II, Muhammad III, Muhammad V. One of the earliest parts we'll look at is the Partal Palacio as well. And then we'll make our way eventually through the gardens and to the Generalife gardens, the Jardines Generalife, which are beautiful, and we'll talk a lot about that as well. But these are the main components we'll look at tonight: the Alcazaba, the Nazarias Palace with the Partal Palace, and the gardens, and then Generalife with the acequia patios up here in the buildings there. So that's the non-detailed plan, and this is the detailed plan. So we're going to cover quite a bit of this tonight, and we'll start with here the Alcazaba, the main fortress. So you can see it with its walls and crenellated walls and towers. So we'll start with that, and here's the Gate of Justice. When you go in, you enter right here. This is the Gate of Justice. And you have other gardens as well in here, gardens and courtyards. But you enter the Gate of Justice. Here's the way it looks now. It does have a horseshoe, a Hudwat arch, as you can see when you get a little closer up, a double horseshoe arch, the Hudwat arch. And then I've noticed the modern door for entry is this tiny little, about 7-foot section. So that gives you a good sense of scale. And most of these pictures that I'm showing you tonight they're put together from various visits, including last year when I was there for about 3 or 4 days. Now, when you get inside, this is the Alcazaba Port of the Vines. It's the interior, and you can see some of the decorations here with the stucco and the tiles, etc. But these are the walls, and you can see that they're constantly being maintained. And then you can see up at the top Islamic crenellation, which is very much part of the crenellation that you see all the way across Spain, Almeria, the Alcazar in Seville. You certainly see it all across Morocco and Rabat, Fez, Meknes, etc. But this Islamic crenellations is standard protection for a Moorish fortress. You can say Islamic crenellation. Then when you're looking down from the tower, we'll come to, these are the foundations of both the barracks and the interior soldiers' town that was here, the soldiers who fought and worked and were stationed here, garrisoned in these barracks. It's a bit like a maze, but this is the foundations are all that was left. Most of the houses had sort of mud brick walls, but the foundations were of stone. And this picture is taken from this tower right there. It's a great view over medieval Moorish Granada, as well as looking backward from that tower, looking back into here now. There's that same tower. It's called the Torre de la Vela. Some say that means the Tower of the Winds. And you climb up the staircase to look back and take those pictures. So you can see concrete and stone foundations of the Castrense barracks. Now, Castrense comes from the old Latin word for a fort, a castra, and it comes into Spanish as Castrense. Now, looking along the walls, you can see different levels of plaster and stoneworking, and you can also see why it was called the Red Fortress. And we're going to come shortly when we look at when we leave the Alcazaba, we'll come into the Nazarius Palace across the courtyards. But the park and the gardens that surround the area, this is the old Moorish quarter here. But you can see across to the Generalife and the Acequia Palace across the hill. Now, the Moors, borrowing from Persia and the Arabic world, they never forgot how important water was because they came from the desert. And as a result, if you've been to Iran at all, I studied in Iran the Qanat aqueducts that are built underground and carrying water from the mountains. So the water of the Sierra Nevadas brings snowmelt water and feeds all the gardens as well as the baths, etc. So that whole system of water conduits, qanats, qanat is an Arabic word, but if you've seen them in Iran, you know how elaborate they can be, 50 miles long and watering a desert place. And the greenery today that you see in Granada, particularly around the Alhambra, is still fed by those same qanat. They're underground and they come to the surface in and around the Alhambra. So now we'll start here with the Mexuar patio and the buildings right here. So we're now entering inside this. You can see Charles V's what I would call monstrosity, which has taken over so much of the Alhambra, and it's a museum today. It's a great museum, but it I would say is not exactly well fitting into the Granada Alhambra. So we'll start here. Everything you see here, all of this is the surviving Nazarius Palace with the Comares Palace and the Palace of the Lions, etc. This is what has survived. And fascinatingly, when the Spanish came with Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, they took it over, but they didn't destroy it. And we can be so grateful that they appreciated to a certain extent the beauty of the Alhambra, even though some of it was destroyed for Charles V's palace. Most of it remains. I would say 80% of it remains. And we'll come back to that. The mosque was right here, and now it's the church of Saint Mary, Iglesia de Santa Maria of the Alhambra, and that's too bad. Part of one of the other palaces, the palace of Yusuf III, is mostly gone, but the gardens survive. And the gardens have been well tended here in the Alhambra for easily 600 to 700 years, and we'll come back to that. The Paradise Gardens, the Paradisa. Now, here's that patio mexuar with its Seville orange trees, and you can see that it is Moorish with these very slender columns, and they're sort of cusped or scalloped arcades here that you see. And then you go inside the mexuar, and remember where that is. That's right here. You're seeing that right there. There's the patio. And you go in, and then here's the corridor from the patio to the Comares Palace. You can see some of the surviving stucco work here. Right here, under the portico, you can actually see about 15 different types of stucco. But we're gonna come in closely. This is called Girih, G-I-R-I-H. But we'll come back to that. Now, here's the patio of the mexuar inside with beautiful, here's some tiles, some Zelish tiles with fountains. There are at least 10 fountains in and around the Alhambra. And the sound of water is very important. And I'll come back to that because it's a multi-sensory place. Eidetically, it's not just eye candy, it's also olfactory with the orange blossoms and the flowers. It's auditory with the sound of the water. To a certain degree, it's tactile. And even though it's bereft of most of its treasures today, I'll show you a few that haven't survived internally, but you can call the walls themselves and the decorations therein treasures. But it was really a multi-sensory feast, and it was intended to be so. Now, here's one of the chamber ceilings. This is what we call tarsi, T-A-R-S-I, the wood paneling, the wood marquetry that you can see here, all geometrized. And this isn't even the most elaborate one. Here's another one, another part of that same audience chamber ceiling. You can see how important geometry is to the what we can call not just Moorish art, but Islamic art. Here's another one. And here you can also see that some of the interior spaces are gilded. Sometimes it's different colors wood. Sometimes it's a thin layer of gold applied to it. But you never get tired of seeing it, but it is saturation when you go to the Alhambra. Now, these are the Zelish tiles that I mentioned. And as I said, here is one, this one from Morocco, but they all came originally. This whole Zelish tile tradition came from Morocco, from the Almohad dynasty and before. So some of the names, Bandi Rumi, when you have these interlaced patterns, that's an old Persian word using the geometry, even though here you can see there's a little bit of repair needed. These are all individual pieces that you're looking at, individual tiles cut to order and different chemistry. So you have cobalt for the blue, you have manganese and copper and sulfur, and iron, and many, many different colors from minerals. They're mineral-based chemistry. Here's some more, and you can see close up here. So you've got carbon for the black, you've got yellow for the sulfur, purple is some of the manganese, some of the orange, some of you can mix iron and sulfur for orange as well as yellow, and then you have mostly cobalt for the blue and copper for the green. And then those glazes, the tiles are cut and then glazed and then baked. You can see many, many different tile patterns, Zelish tile patterns in the Alhambra. These are just a few that you can see. I'll come back to them. But notice over one of the doors, we'll see this in the Comares Palace. This is the alfiz decoration over the door in interlacing tiles. And then here's the stucco work, more of the Zelish tiles. So the Alhambra is one of the best repositories in the world for this Moorish style of tiling, geometric tiles. I probably have just 300 pictures of the tiles alone, because every pattern is unique. And I took another probably 1,000 pictures of Zelish tiles in Morocco last month. Some of them are really elaborate, as you can see here. They're both tiles, but there's also little stucco carvings, and each of these have to be fit together and cemented in. So the elaborate work that you see here is mind-boggling when you think about it. Now, this is the minor Nasrid Palace. It's just down the hill. It was called the House of the Great Wooden Wheel. House in Arabic is Dar, so Dar al-Malhara al-Kubra. But now it's called the Royal Quarter of San Domingo. When the Dominicans took it over, believe it or not, this is where Torquemada, the Inquisitor General of the Inquisition, lived, which is a sad fact. But at least it survived. And you can see some of the wooden tile work, wooden lattice work that I mentioned as well, Musharabia here. And the lattice works, whether it's stone or wood, it's to keep the sun out, but to allow breezes to flow, and sometimes for privacy. But now let's come back specifically. That palace is over here, just down the hill. But by the way, when you go to Granada and you want to stay literally within the archaeological park, there are several places you could stay, but I recommend this, the Alhambra Palace Hotel, which is right here, adjacent to the park. And it's fabulous. There it is. Here's the park of the Alhambra, and there's the Alhambra Palace. It's a wonderful 5-star hotel. I'd highly recommend staying it. And this picture I took of the hotel was from the Manuel de Falla Cultural Center, which is along the edge of the park too. And I guess that was my corner rooms right there. So that's the Alhambra Palace Hotel. I would highly recommend. It's the most convenient place to stay in Granada if you go back to Granada, or if you go there. But now let's continue into the Nazarius Palace. We'll come to the Comares area, the Comares Tower, and so on. But here's that tile I showed you, Balat, and it's carved and sometimes painted, but filled in. And the relief, the geometric relief here of the interlacings is sort of meant to be a little bit like a maze. When you think of mazes as spiritual conundrums or meditation motifs, I'm sure that a lot of the Moorish art, particularly at the Alhambra, is meant to be meditative. You can sort of get not lost in the details, but you can definitely sink into these details and almost in a contemplative way. Now, as I mentioned, the Mozarabic ideas, where you can see that that scudo, that shield, is the heraldry which was borrowed from the Europeans, but there's that phrase of the Nasrids, there is no victor but Allah. And notice the carving around it. This is the Atariq vegetal abstract carving, sometimes foliated. Sometimes it's not as abstract, and sometimes it's even naturally identifiable. But you don't always have perfect adherence to the anti-iconic principle. As I said, both the Sufis and certainly the Shias, until recently, did not abide by that anti-iconic principle, which is probably itself borrowed by Muhammad from the 10 Commandments about having no graven images. Now, let's go into the Comares Palace. And the Comares Palace is named after a group of Spaniards called Comares. But it's been an old name, but when we look at the details of it, with the tower and so on, and we'll look at some of these features inside the Comares Palace now. This is all the Comares Palace here. Remember, this was the Meksuar, and the Comares Palace has many different features. the Hall of the Blessing, as well as some of the other towers. So this is the Comares courtyard. And again, notice the details of the stucco work. And this is that Alfi's doorway that I showed you already with the beautiful Zelish tiles. I showed you a close-up of this. You have a little bit of Mukarna, sort of what we call stalactite or beehive style feature here architecturally. Here's a close-up of it. And look at this. It's just astonishing. I think when I spent about just even a half an hour in this courtyard alone, I counted well over 20 different stucco tile patterns. It's mesmerizing. You can just see the details in here with a lot of, sometimes you have Arabic script, and some of the verses are Quranic and some of them are verses of poetry in calligraphy. Now, this is the interior stucco with the Giri stucco tiles and some of the windows. And you could call these mullioned, except that it's glass, but it's surrounded, it's little glass blebs, little glass tiles surrounded with a very fine lattice work. And here again, you can see this Mukarna. This is the archway where the spandrels of the arch, underneath the actual column above the capital, you can see this sort of beehive feature, this stalactite feature called Mukarna. And you see it all over the Islamic world. The most beautiful Mukarna I've ever seen is in Isfahan in the Shah Mosque in Iran, when I was there in cultural diplomacy a few years back. But the Mukarna is elaborate when we get to the Palace of the Lions. It's just staggering. More of the tile work that I said all through this palace. You see mostly on the lower areas where you walk by up to about your waist. You can see the Zelish tile work sometimes above you. Then the stucco work is above that. Now, this, as I said, is a Tariq, Balat, and Jali. This is the stone lattice work window. That's called Jali. That's actually a word borrowed from Mughal India. And even though Mughal India is after the Alhambra, the term has been borrowed in. So more of this beautiful tile work with the Islamic calligraphy, and even the spandrels of the arch this is definitely a tariq, abstract vegetal motif. Now I want to go into the great patio of the myrtles, the Patio de Arayanes, with its pools. And then here's the Comares Tower. We'll look at that again. So here is the Court of the Myrtles, the Patio de Arayanes. Now, when I was there, I've been there in summer, I've been there in spring, I've been there in fall. And in summer, of course, you have a lot more vegetation and floral garden, but it's beautiful to be there in March. I think I was there in March 22 the last time, and it wasn't cold, but actually the sort of cloudy skies made more of the architectural details pop, because there was less polarization on your eyes. You could focus more on the architectural details. If there's too much sun, it can be blinding. You don't appreciate it as much. But here is the other side, and you can see this is the opposite end. And when you go from here and you continue all the way to the end, you come into what is called the Sala de Barca. Remember, baraka means blessing. And of course, if you know Barack Obama's name, that Barack is that word for blessing, but this is the Spanish way to say it. If you know the Hebrew, it's pretty much the same word, baraka. But here, notice the Mukarna, the beautiful, deep Mukarna stalactite features here in the Hall of Blessing, with very slender columns. And sometimes this is arresting because the weight bearing on those columns doesn't always make sense. And yet the columns are very, very strong. And very often, this isn't so much this isn't solid. There's a hollow area inside much of the details that's then stuccoed after the fact. Now here is some more of the tarsi wood marquetry ceilings in the room of blessing, the Sala de Barca, and you can see they're very different. Any one room has the same ceiling. I've never seen the same ceiling of wood marquetry, tarsi, ever repeated in the Alhambra. Every single room that has the tarsi wood marquetry has a different wood ceiling. Here's some more with more of that sort of atariq vegetal giri stucco, and as well, you can see over the doorway, it's not an arch, but you can see an alcove here, which is basically called an iwan. And then notice the muqarna again above it. Now, this room, if you look, they put in Latin. They took out the calligraphic Islamic script here. You can still see it on the sides, but this is Latin above, which means it happened after 1492. So there wasn't that much alteration by the Spanish Christians, but here you can see a little bit along the top of the ceiling, or at least the ceiling merging with the wall. Now this is the most detailed tarsi wood marquetry. If you look at this, what you're looking at, I think you can count well over 300 small inlaid pieces of wood of slightly different colors, and with a little gilded, sometimes you have a little finial that's gilded. But if you look at this, everything here is a different piece of wood. So it's easy to see that there are hundreds of inlays in this entarsated wood marquetry ceiling, what we call tarsi from the Arabic. This is the flourishing of geometry. Now, looking the other way, this is now looking sort of to the east. This is the Comares Tower. You're looking the opposite direction, and notice this water that would flow in from a basin, from an internal fountain, and now it would have flown into, it would have literally dropped down into that pool in the patio of the Myrtles, the Patio de Arayanes, except it's turned off right now. But the sound is fascinating, and I'll come back to sound elements later. So here, when you go into the Comares Tower, this is called the room or the Hall of the Ambassadors. And look at this. So that's the tower right there at the end. And this is the actual decoration on the walls, the Hall of the Ambassadors. This is where the Sultan received visitors for hundreds of years. And notice, if you look closely at this one, on the wall, I've read, I haven't counted, I've counted well over 100, but it said that there are 150 different style of tile patterns in this room, the Hall of the Ambassadors. Again, you can see the Quranic script, and then here's the Nasrid motto that was on their pennant, also on the wall. There is no victor but Allah. 150 different stucco patterns in this room, the Hall of the Ambassadors. It is almost impossible to grasp the complexity of this stucco work. And remember, it's stucco, so it's plaster. It's a calcium carbonate and sulfate mixed together, both calcium carbonate and gypsum, crushed and then solidifies, and then it's carved. And it's usually some of the tiles are carved individually, and then they fit together geometrically. If there's a bezel, this would fit into one that had an indentation. But some of this is carved in place. So not all these tiles are single tiles. They're carved sometimes piecemeal after the stucco has dried for a long time. So more of this, the Hall of the Ambassadors. mostly with Quranic verses about justice. And this motif that you see right here, I'm not sure you can see, this is called Darjwa Kitab, step and shoulder motif here. And this is a motif that you see all over the Islamic world, particularly in the homeland of the Moors, the Nasrid dynasty. When you go to Rabat, or when you go to the Kotarubia Marrakesh mosque, this is a very important Moorish motif that you see all over the Moorish world, particularly the homeland of the Nasrids of Granada, Morocco. Now look at the ceiling of this one. The inlay here is wood, but it also includes either bone or ivory. And you may know that in Morocco, they often use camel bone in the intarsation. But this could either be bone, but in some places it's ivory. So this is the marquetry of the ceiling with a muqarna in wood along the edge. So in just, as I said, just incredible to see the details in the Hall of the Ambassadors, so Sala de los Embajadores. All right, we're going to move now to the little gardens tucked away inside here, the Linda Raja garden, just inside between the Comares Palace and the Palace of the Lions, or the Patio de Leones. So the little beautiful garden in here, and you can just see it when you're going from chamber to chamber, from section. You can look down and see a beautiful Islamic garden. And we'll talk about parterre gardens, four-part gardens with Generalife, and why that's important in tradition. So you see this from multiple views in and around the Alhambra. You can see it from the ground level. You can see it from the upper level. Of course, you climb stairs as you're going through the process. And by the way, I know some of you, if you've been in the last 10 years to the Alhambra, sometimes, for example, I wouldn't go in the summer. It's too hot. Plus, they time you. They push you through too fast. It's much better to go in off season. So when I was there in March, I could dilly-dally, and I could take as much time as I wanted. Nobody pushing past me or pushing me out. No guards to say, move on. But in the summer, it's different because this place receives thousands upon thousands of visitors. And you can't appreciate it if you're being pushed through too fast. So now we're going to go into the Court of the Lions with all its constituent parts. There are many different parts here in the courtyard of the Lions. You have the Hall of Two Sisters, the Hall of the Kings. There are lots of different places to see in and around the courtyard, but this is usually the most iconic part when people look at the architectural detail of these colonnades. Here it is. This was my lead picture. Look at this detail and the preponderance of, I think, photos that I see about the Alhambra are usually from this Court of the Lions, the Patio de Leones, and the Palace of the Leones. So you have all kinds of things here. Again, you have the Darj wa Kitab. Here's the Darj wa Kitab, but it has an interior decoration as well. Here's Darj wa Kitab that's much shallower with Atarik. Here is the Muqarna style of the stalactite honeycombs. And even looking close up here, you can definitely see that this is vegetal and maybe not so abstract. And then you have, again, calligraphy. And then the Muqarna here has cobalt and sometimes crushed lapis lazuli in the literal hollows of the Muqarna. And you know how precious lapis lazuli is, coming all the way from Badakhshan, Afghanistan. So the Court of the Lions, as I said, it's probably the centerpiece of the Alhambra. And it's, by the way, most of the Court of the Lions is early 15th century, late 14th and early 15th century. But as I said, it is just astonishing to look at the details here in this particularly the Giri relief stucco with Dar Wakatab and the Mukarna honeycomb and so on, or we can say honeycomb stalactites that you see. Here it is again, close-up detail. Again, more of the tarsi marquetry in every ceiling is different, as I said. So if you look here at how deep the Mukarna is, and then the Darjwa Katab arabesques here, and what's really important is to remember the way light plays over the relief. That's deliberate, whether it's deep relief or shallow relief, and whether it's in shadow or in full light, as you can see here. It takes your eyes a long time to try to pick out individual details because there's so much visual saturation here. And of course, there's also the sound of the water from the fountain of the lions. There it is. And this is interesting because those lions are not as animated or as natural as they could be, but then that's partly because of the anti-iconic principle. They're not so used to carving animal figures. And while the fountain sometimes is on and sometimes is off, the echoes across the courtyard of the fountain, I much prefer the echoes of the water to the sound of voices. But I've never been in this Palace of the Lions courtyard without, it's pretty hard to be here and not be surrounded by people. Now we're going to move to the Two Sisters Hall right here in a minute. And then we'll go to the room of the kings, and we'll also look at some of the other rooms in this palace. This is the Mukarna dome. Now, a dome, I passed over this quickly in the glossary, but a dome in Arabic is called a kuba, Qubba. But this is all Mukarna work. It's all stalactite stucco that's carved, and it's you can hardly get a picture of it. It is so detailed. Here's a far picture in this essentially octagonal dome. And remember that the Moors, the Islamic culture, would take a square and put on that an octagon, and then put on that a round dome. So they would go in 3 stages. And the Mukarna is the way they infilled the spandrels between the square to the octagon. But here, you start off with an octagon. Here's another close-up of it. Look at that. The depth of this kuba, the depth of the Mukarna dome is about 27 feet from the windows to the top. And it's hard to grasp that. But just unbelievable to see all the detail in this Mukarna dome. Now, more of the same palace details. In one of the Palace of the Lions, you can walk out and you can look out onto the Lindaraha Gardens from the alcoves. And this was a royal a relief room for the kings, the emirs, the sultans. I'll interchange those words. Notice even the shallow Mukarna at the top of the wall here. And then again, calligraphy. Always this flowing calligraphy. There's that same room. Excuse me. So this is an Iwan portico, and you can look down again on the Lindaraha Gardens, but then more Zelish tiles that come to basically about chest high. And then notice you can see that calligraphic stucco with a pigment that is made mostly from lapis lazuli. And again, most of these are verses of poetry. These are not necessarily Quranic. So now from the bottom level, you can see the Lindaraha courtyard again. I'll come back to why partition gardens are important in the Islamic world. And you have all these beautiful, in this case, the Seville oranges with their really intense fragrance and the blossoms. Now, this is the Sala de los Abenjarajes. That's another Spanish word that has been applied after the fact. But it was also a reception room. And notice that the room itself is polygonic. You're looking at all the different walls here. And then notice it's one giant muqarna. So another kuba, another dome that's muqarna. It may not be as elaborate, but by the fact that the room we saw, the Hall of Two Sisters, which remember is a muqarna dome. This one maybe has more detail and more depth, but this one is the whole room is a geometric polygon, like a giant star. And again, with enormous detail and lapis lazuli-like pigments. So it would have been originally blue off cream as a sort of bichromatic plan. It's just astonishing. Look at this. The whole dome is a polygon. Now, these are the royal baths. And again, you can see multiple types of both tile work, Zelish tile and stucco and so on. And I want to move now to the Hall of the Kings right here. So when you think of these, this right here was the Abenjahares room we just looked at. This was the Hall of Two Sisters. They both have Kuba muqarna domes. Now we're going to move to the Hall of the Kings. And this has a fascinating detail that you don't usually see. It's pretty rare. So here you can see the different partitions across that, and they've been reinforced with iron, maybe for stabilization, but it kind of takes a little bit away from the beautiful muqarna. You pass under these muqarna arches, some more rounded, some more the parabolas are more bent, and then you again have this detail. But up above, if you look up in the ceilings, you see something very unusual. Above the muqarna passageways, as you're passing through each of these arches, above you have paintings, and these are a group, essentially. You can say it's a group of about a dozen sultans. These are the Nasrid dynasties that you're looking at here, but this was not done until the 15th century. But each one of these sultans has his sword, and in different phases of their lives. So it's very unusual to see a painted ceiling because it's breaking the anti-iconic rule. And then another ceiling actually has a sort of, we can call it Mozarabic, meaning a blending of Christian and Moorish style. And you can see up here a sort of a jousting tournament with Christians in their heraldry, as well as a hunter who is Moorish, hunting a deer. And by the way, sometimes you see gazelles in the art, and that's deliberate because the gazelle, our word gazelle comes from Arabic. It's ghazal, and the word ghazal actually is a poetic stanza form for a leaping rhythm. And it's even in the Canticles, the Song of Songs has that same motif of a stanzaic ghazal, a leaping rhythm. You may recall that in the Canticles, the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, borrowed from some Near Eastern context. The gazelle has been pretty ubiquitous in the Near East, but the term ghazal is a very, very old word, even pre-Arabic. Now I want to go into the next phase. This is a very old phase. This is 13th century, the Palacio Partal, and it's a beautiful part of the Alhambra. Unfortunately, the Palace of Yusuf III is gone, but the gardens remain. So let's now go into the Palacio Partal. So here it is, again with its pools and palms. And it may not be as arresting on the outside, but it has some beautiful views out to the old Moorish quarter. And it has some beautiful, in the Tower of the Ladies, the Torre de las Damas, a beautiful ceiling and more. There's a lot of Zelish tile work in here. You can also see this arcade. Even from here, you can look down. You can see the arcade looks down to the Moorish quarter of Old Granada. When you go inside, here's this Moorish quarter called Albaycin, and you can see down into it with a lot of cypress trees and gardens. And then notice the Jali stone windows, this lattice work that's filled with glass. And then this is the tower of the ladies. This is one of the most intricate ceilings with Muqarna's small kuba. Look at little tiny domes. You have these octagons in the patterns with little Muqarna domes. And then here is another dome here, slight dome. It's a shallow dome, but the marquetry that you're seeing tonight, no one room has the same marquetry tarsi ceiling. So this is in the Palacio Partal, Tower of the Ladies. And then these are the gardens and what's left of the Yusuf III palace. You can see some of the foundations are surviving with Zelish tiles on the floor. And you're looking back to the Palacio Partal. But now, if we look at what's left of the Palacio Yusuf III, this would be late 14th, early 15th century. And the water courses are just, as I said, to hear water flowing is itself an acoustic marvel because it really enhances the multisensory experience. So I want to move to the next slide. I want you to hear it. I'm just going to do that again. The water flows from place to place to place, and every time it drops with a different sound, and you can follow it as I did. I took this little video, as you can see. Now, just in this one context, as I said, you have maybe a dozen different sounds of falling water, and that's all deliberate. And remember, to a desert culture, as the Moors were, water is the most precious thing possible. Now, I see a raised hand. Is it William Grindley? Did you have a question that's you can go ahead and unmute yourself for a moment, as long as it's not going to take too long, because I'm probably running out of time.
No. The question is, how did the Moors and Christians keep the Alhambra from burning down, that's wooden ceilings, or the ceilings from becoming covered in smoke like you find in cathedrals?
Right. The Nasrids really protected it, and they didn't have, they had braziers, but they didn't have fireplaces. And there's a lot of open air circulation in these rooms. It may not seem like it, but there are many access. In the summertime, to have the airflow is really critical. And so the airflow is pretty constant in there, and that would probably dissipate whatever smoke there might be. But they didn't build fires. Even in the winter time, this place isn't super cold. You're close to the Sierra Madre Mountains, but there are a lot of individual personal braziers that people have. A small brass, literally a brazier is a small brass heating implement with wood or whatever they're using, charcoal, to keep warm. But the Christians were so astonished when Ferdinand and Isabella came in 1492. They didn't really want to destroy anything. And while they moved in to a certain degree, parts of it, and altered a little bit of it, it wasn't until Charles V's 1520 agglomeration. That's where the Christians lived, was in that big square palace. They didn't touch or alter, as I said, 80% of the Alhambra, and that's why it has survived today. They respected it, which is really unusual. Now I'm going to move on because we're going to get now to more of the gardens. So these were the gardens of Yusuf III. His Palacio is destroyed. Now they're called the Gardens of San Francisco. But many of these plants, these boxwood, Buxissa plants, they've had the exact same pattern for 500 years or more. The roots are really old, and they just keep them like topiary trimmed. So I'm sure they die off and are replaced, but they retain the patterns. Now, if we're looking out, and here's the Al Partal Palace right here. If you're looking out all the way up the hill to the Henrife Gardens. So now we're going to move up this way. But before we do, these are part of these Yusuf II Gardens and the Gardens of San Francisco and so on. And then this is the Tower of the Infantas. And we're just going to stop there briefly along the way. Here's a picture of it from as you're moving away from the Alhambra and you curve up the valley in this glen and you're heading towards the Henrife Gardens. Here's the Tower of the Infantas. I wanted to just read a very brief excerpt by Washington Irving about this. In an evening stroll up a narrow glen overshadowed by fig trees, pomegranates, and myrtles, which divides the lands of the fortress from those of the Henrife, I was struck with the romantic appearance of the Moorish tower in the outer wall of the Alhambra. It rose high above the treetops and caught the ruddy rays of the setting sun. So here it is right here. And here it is from my picture as I was recalling Washington Irving here. A solitary window at a great height commanded a view of the glen, and as I was regarding it, Washington Irving says, a young female looked out with her head adorned with flowers. She was evidently superior to the usual class of people that inhabit the old towers of the fortress, and this sudden and picturesque glimpse of her reminded me of the descriptions of captive beauties in fairy tales. These fanciful associations of my mind were increased on being informed by my attendant Mateo that this was the Tower of the Princesses, La Torre de las Infantas, so called from having been, according to tradition, the residences of the daughters of the Moorish kings. I have since visited the tower. It is not generally shown to strangers, though well worthy of attention, for the interior is equal for beauty of architecture and delicacy of ornament to any part of the palace. So he's saying, in contrast to the look from the outside, the interior is he says, equal in beauty to anything else. The elegance of the central hall with its marble fountain, its lofty arches, and richly fretted dome, the arabesques and stucco work of the small but well-proportioned chamber, though injured by time and neglect, all accord with the story of its being anciently the abode of royal beauty. The little old fairy queen who lives under the staircase of the Alhambra and frequents the evening tertulias of Dame Antonia tells some fanciful traditions about three Moorish princesses who were once shut up in this tower by their father, one of the tyrant Sultan kings of Granada, and were only permitted to ride out at night about the hills when no one else was permitted to come in their way under pain of death. They still, or their ghosts, according to her account, the old fairy queen, may be seen occasionally when the moon is full, riding in lonely places along the mountainside on palfreys, richly caparisoned and sparkling with jewels, but they vanish upon being spoken to. And then after that, he relates the story of the captive three beautiful princesses. But I would really encourage you to read Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. Some of them are like reading stories from the Arabian Nights with genies and old wizened viziers and magical wise men who live hundreds of years. It's a wonderful book, Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. But let's continue on to the Henrife Garden. So here's the Tower of the Las Infantas, the Tower of the Princesses, and this is part of the interior that you can see. It had once, you can see it had Zelish tiles all the way along on all the sides up to literally the top of your head, but they're mostly gone. And this is just a plaque because Washington Irving was here in 1829, living in the Alhambra, basically renting rooms. Now let's move on to the Henry Lee Fay Gardens that you see up here. These are what we call the Henry Lee Fay Gardens. They're on the hill above, so they're higher up. And the walls of the gardens are foliage. So walls of green, very much kept trimmed. Look at this. Walls of green. And much of this is either cypress or cedar or juniper. It's coniferous. And when it's cedar, it's really fragrant as well. So these gardens, I'm sure if you've been there, depending on the time of year, it really doesn't matter. They're beautiful any time of the year. And of course, you know, when you think of Mediterranean or subtropical gardens, the bougainvillea, of course, are all over the walls. Now, I want to point out something. This is there are four pools here that merge. They're not wide at this end; they're long, and you can see lots of fountains. But this is what you call parterre, divided into four, and that's an old Persian tradition. If you went to Pasargad, when I was a postdoc at Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies, my mentor, David Stronach, had excavated the palace of Cyrus the Great at Pasargad in Persia. And he describes the Shahar Bagh, the four-part gardens. And the word for that, an enclosed garden with four channels of water, or parterre, the word is Shahar Bagh, but this is the old Persian word Padidaiza. Padidaiza in Old Zendavestan Persian going way back before Cyrus into the Bronze Age. Padidaiza is one of the oldest words surviving in the world. Padidaiza was borrowed by the Greeks to become Pedadesos from Alexander's travels and when he went to Persia. But Padidaiza became Padadesos, Paradeisos, and then it was brought to Rome and Latinized as Paradisus, Paradisus, from which we get our word paradise. You may know, again, going back to the Canticles, an enclosed garden is very important in the Near East, a wall to keep the east wind out or the desert wind and the sand. And you may know in the Song of Songs where the author or authors, the poet says, a garden enclosed is my bride, my love, Gan Naul. And then the word pardes is borrowed into Hebrew from that same Persian source, Padidaiza. So all these words about paradise, if you look at Genesis 2:9 and following about the four rivers of Eden, it's the same tradition, regardless of which comes first. Padidaiza is an incredibly old, an incredibly venerable, ancient Near Eastern tradition. And these people venerated watercourses because they were from the desert. Here's another example of it. You can see the four channels come together here. So you see the long one and then the two side ones. And this is what their rugs really were. They were Padidaiza. They were paradise gardens. They were gardens they could roll up. Here you can see a Shahar Bagh Padidaiza with four water channels with fish in it with a fountain in the middle. This is parterre, Shahar Bagh Padidaiza. I have a copy of this rug downstairs in my hall that I bought in years ago in Istanbul. Here's the idea of a Padidaiza, the pool of water in the middle, and then surrounded by flowers and lotus and floating flowers in the water. So here's a famous Safavid Shahar Bagh Padidaiza carpet, definitely with its four channels of water with birds and fish coming around it. And this one is probably from Shah Tahmasp's period in Safavid Persia. So here's another Shahar Bagh with a pool of water with parterre, Shaharbag Padidisa. So that's what you have here, because all over the Islamic world, this tradition was brought from Persia to Iraq, Mesopotamia, to Saudi Arabia, and then it spread with Islam all the way across to Egypt. It spread to Sicily. Of course, it spread to Morocco. I've seen many of these Padidisa Shaharbags in Morocco, as well as in Spain. And the Generalife Gardens is the best example of it at the Alhambra. Now, just speaking of some of the treasures that were in these rooms, they're gone now. The walls are fantastic, but you can imagine how filled they were when the Nasrid sultans lived there. This is called the Alhambra vase. I took this picture in the National Archaeology Museum, Museo Arqueológico Nacional in Madrid. It's about 4 feet tall, and you can see one side of it here, slightly broken. The wing was broken off right there. Here's another view of it from a book, and you can see it had calligraphy as well as details. The other counterpart vase to it that was here in the Alhambra, now in the museum in Madrid, is this one, which is a copper glaze called lusterware. So they literally use liquid copper as a glaze pattern that you can see here. Here's the Alhambra vase. So I took this picture too in Madrid. And then you can see more lusterware. This I just took in the Louvre about a month ago. This lusterware, it's copper glazed lusterware. And by the way, Robert Knight and I was also walking around the Notre Dame and seeing all the work on it. It's pretty astonishing. But this one's from the Louvre from about a month ago. But these vases are literally some of the treasures, and we only have 2 of these big vases left that were in the Alhambra. The walls, though, I guess they make up for it, the walls and ceilings in Muqarna. Here you can see a plaque that has the Nasrid motto on it. This came from Granada. These are these are bones or copies of bones that are used for medical studies in the medical schools that were there. Here's this famous box, the Tarsi box, what we call Musharibia. And if it's Morocco, you can smell the intense cedar. I have a few pieces of this that I just brought back from this trip to Morocco. And then medical treatises. Can you imagine when in 1492, when the church took over Granada, it burned 80,000 Islamic manuscripts when it destroyed the madrasa and the mosque. 80,000 texts were burned because they were said to be of the devil. You know, what a loss. I mean, you even think of Moses Maimonides, who was a medical doctor and who attended in Cairo. He was the physician to literally Saladin in the 12th century. The medical knowledge that was lost may be irreplaceable. Who knows? But here's one of these beautiful cedar box inlays with bone or ivory. That's also in Madrid. And then this is the what's called the Pyxis of Zamora of ivory. This is not identical to it. This is a similar one. Both of these are in the National Archives Museum. All the ivory that was there with here, in this case, Kufic Islamic script, sort of orthogonal Kufic script along the tops of these ivory pixies. So the treasures that were there here, also in Madrid, it was the box, a painted arc of ivory. And you can see it's sort of Mozarabic because these images are not, the Islamic rule would not be fond of these images, but you can see the Kufic Islamic script around the box. So the first box itself was Islamic and possibly altered. This one as well in the National Archaeology Museum in Madrid. And then this was a silken cloth banner. It was a cloth of gold banner. It was captured in the Battle of Tolosa when the Almohads were pulling back and Granada was going to be about all that was left. And Alfonso VIII of Castile, it's now in the Monasterio de las Huelgas in Burgos in Spain, but it's silk and cloth of gold. These were sort of things that would be hanging on walls that weren't already decorated with stucco relief and with Zelish tiles, these silk and cloth of gold banners. All right, so much for the lost treasures. Let's go back now. Let's go up here to the Arasikia patio. This is the patio, and you can just see in March of last year with all the fountains. There are literally about 20 different fountains in this patio of the Asequia Palace with the pools. And then this is the Mirador, a very beautiful sort of place of repose for the sultans at the top of the Generalife with the Seville oranges and the Musharrabia latticework windows that can close. And then this was the Medina. This was the shopping center, the market. It's now gone, but it's an archaeological work, and you can walk by it, but there's really not a lot to see except a few foundations. And then this is, as I said, where the mosque was and is now the Iglesia de Santa Maria del Granada or del Alhambra. It's now a church, so nothing of the mosque has left. But it would have had, the foundations are there. If you go into the church, you can see the foundations of the mosque, but it's pretty well destroyed. And it wasn't destroyed immediately. It wasn't destroyed really until the late 16th century. But then you have the sort of the Carmen de los Martires. You have a lot of these tiles in and around Granada where the martyrs that were freed and then or killed, different martyrs, because these sultans, they may have loved beauty, but they weren't necessarily always peaceable. In fact, several of the sultans died by assassination. In fact, one of the most enlightened ones, Yusuf III, died by assassination, and he was a good sultan. Others killed each other off too. There were plenty of stabbings of sultans. The one thing you don't want to be is if you have multiple wives or concubines, and if you're the child of the harem, your life may not be long. If you're a boy, your competitors, your rivals may make sure you don't live to your majority, because you could usurp their throne or compete with them for the sultanship. Now, this is the Centro Manuel de Falla. When you think of Spanish composers like Manuel de Falla, I can often hear Rodrigo's Aranjuez in my mind. But I went to a concert there. My wife and I went to a concert here at the Manuel de Falla Center, because it was right, it was a 3-minute walk from the hotel. And, there's still a lot of things you can buy. There's still lots of Medina and inlays that you can buy in and around this area, like in here. You have these beautiful streets with the wonderful tile work that named the streets and the house addresses. This is the Centro Manuel de Falla right there, where you can go for concerts and poetry. You know that Lorca, the poet, the Spanish poet, Garcia Lorca, was from Granada, and he was assassinated because of he was considered too pro-Moorish history as a poet. The fascists did not like Lorca. But anyway, he was from Granada, and he even said that he had Morisco blood. So we're basically done, but I just want to finish up with a little bit. These are the high gardens way up here. They're above. I'm not sure you can see them. They're above my mask, so I'm not sure you can see them, but they're at the very top, the high gardens of the Asequia and Generalife. And this is one of the canals that brings water from the mountains, and it comes out here. The little bit of rock that was over it, the top of the aqueduct, is off, and you can still see and hear this water flowing from the mountains to make the gardens green and lush. So this place, and here you can see the Church of St. Mary of the Alhambra over where the mosque was. The Alhambra has to be one of the marvels of the world. And the last king, Muhammad XII, who's called Boabdil, when Ferdinand Isabel came, he left, gave them the keys, literally. And this is a romantic painting of it from basically, it's romanticized 18th, 19th century, but you can see he's leaving the Granada. He bids for all. And by the way, he went under the nearby hill and he wept. There's that weeping Boabdil story. And his wife said, well, if you'd fought harder, you wouldn't be weeping now. Charles V, when he came to Granada, when he came to the Alhambra, before he was building his own Renaissance palace here, that's such a monstrosity, he said, ill-fated was the man who lost it. Well, here's Boabdil, as he's called, Muhammad VI, who has to relinquish it. He has to relinquish the Alhambra and Granada to the Spanish Christians. And he tried to extract from them a promise that they would preserve it, because he said its beauty was inestimable, and he was right. But if you go to Paris, I just took this picture last month. This is his sword. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale Museum in Paris. So here's Boabdil's sword. You can see it right here. The sword of Boabdil, made in Toledo about 1480. And he had to give this sword to Ferdinand. There it is, Boabdil's sword, as a national treasure now of France. There's the pommel and hilt of it. This is one side. This is the side that I didn't take. This is not the picture side, is the one I just showed you. With really, there it is. There's the Nasrid emblem right there. There's the Nasrid motto. There is no victor but Allah. What an irony that is, to have to give this sword that says there is no victor but Allah, the Nasrid motto, to Ferdinand. So that's the story of Boabdil's loss of Granada and the Alhambra, having to welcome Ferdinand in. So there we have it, the Red Fortress, or the Fortress of Muhammad the Redhead. However you look at it, there is no question that it's one of the marvels of the world, and you can never get enough of it. And please, if you really want to appreciate it, do not go in high summer with thousands upon thousands. Go in the off season when you can take your time and appreciate and savor its beauty in every way: visual, auditory, olfactory. It is an astonishing place. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
What a delight to share this. I feel my soul has been fed in sharing this tonight.
Lovely. Would you like to stop sharing your screen so you can see people?
But if anybody had questions, I can go back.
Go back and forth, right? So are there questions? Raise your hand or speak up.
Yes, please. Just go ahead and speak up.
William?
Patrick, who authorized and designed the patterns that we saw on the walls and ceilings?
Is that Kathy Mize?
Yes.
Recognize your voice, Kathy. Hello.
Thank you.
Who authorized the scenes? The
Who
Sultan.
authorized the designs?
Yeah. The sultans always had a stable of artists and craftspersons and workshops, and they had viziers. They literally had artistic directors, because while they appreciated the work, they were probably presented with a whole array of different possibilities. And then they probably chose, or sometimes they delegated. But it was always a royal cooperative to have the artisans. And by the way, there were artisanal quarters that have been mostly destroyed. And where they were apparently is where Charles V built his monstrosity here, the artisans' quarters and workshops.
Was there any symbolism in the stars?
Yes. Astronomy was a big deal to the Islamic world. In fact, if you know our word Almagest, literally is an Arabic word, the treasury of stars. And the Arabs of the Near East inherited the Babylonian star charts. And so many, I mean, I would say, if you think of all the names of stars today, Deneb, Betelgeuse, Altair, many of our star names today are still in Arabic. And they were mathematically very prone, not just to geometry. Remember, the word algebra also comes from. So stars and the geometry and the patterns and the skies. The desert, as you probably know, one of the most enchanting evenings I've had in my entire life was 3 weeks ago in Morocco in the Sahara Desert under the stars. I couldn't count them. I could not count them. They were so brilliant. So stars are very important in Islamic lore, in Quranic Sudra, of course, in the mathematical calculations. So yeah, the star patterns that you've seen, like in some of those polygons, like the roof of the what we saw, the two Muqarna domes that were very star patterned at the. If we can go back here, you can see stars in the tiles. See stars.
Yes.
I'd boggle your eyes here, but we go back to some of these ceilings. You see,
Yeah.
are like star patterns, and you also saw the tiles that have stars on them. Both the tiles and the stucco have stars. So stars, you could call those stars, but some of the actual small tiles go way back here. You have star patterns or floral patterns. Look at these stars, you see.
Right.
It's here in the Zellige tiles. So yeah, stars are very, here's some more. Yeah, stars are very important. In the National Museum, I didn't show it tonight, but in the National Museum in Madrid is a very famous astrolabe, which measured the stars. It's 11th century, and without the astrolabe that the Moors gave to Al-Andalus, Spain, our age of exploration wouldn't have happened. And by the way, Christopher Columbus was here. He was at Granada when it was handed over to Ferdinand. And he actually said, as joyful as we should be, this is also a sad moment. But the astrolabe and the tradition of astronomy and navigation by the stars, our age of exploration in the 16th, late 15th, early 16th would not have happened without the mathematics and engineering of this world.
Right.
Bob Nyden, do you have a question?
I do. As a fabricator, I want to know how in the world they created all of those patterns in stucco. Did they start with stamping into the wet stucco, or was it templates, or how did they do all those identical patterns?
That's a good question too. The tiles you can see are individually made.
Right.
And they start out with a pattern with compasses and rulers, and then start, elaborating from the compasses and rulers and angles. So it's all based on geometry. But then to stamp some of these tiles, let's go back to the stucco work here. Some of this some of this is stamped, you're right, and some of it is hand carved. Some of it are individual tiles, but it would take, as far as we know, even to create this arch would take weeks, if not months. First, you have to, if you don't have individual tiles that are cemented in, if you have a template and you have a stamp pattern that you're repeating, or if you're carving, you start out with a pencil or crayon, and then you cut out your pattern with a small chisel. This stuff is not hard because it's, gypsum, calcium sulfate, it's like wallboard.
Right.
It's not, because this stucco is a combination of calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate. So it's harder, but it's more durable. And we don't understand all the details. I didn't show you this picture. I could maybe, if I pull up, I'm not sure this is going to, no, I don't think it's going to work. No, what do you see on the screen now? Do you see anything?
Yes.
What do you, sorry?
Palacio Comares.
Okay. Well, let me, okay. I don't think it's going to work for me to share easily here. So I'm just going to come back to this.
That's fine.
But you can go to the workshops today around the Alhambra, and they make these cutouts, these patterns. I might be able to do this, but it's going to be pretty tricky. No, I don't think I can do it. Let me try though. I can show you how they're still making some of this inlay work. You still see the Comares Palace image?
Yes.
Yeah, it's okay. I can look up more. I just thought if you had a really quick answer, which is obviously not possible with this complicated carving.
I have a photo, but it's going to take me a minute to pull it up.
That's fine.
But I'll tell you what, if there's another question in the interim, I'll come back to that and show you a little bit of how the crafts are still being perpetuated in Granada. Right there on the Alhambra, they have workshops to show you how this is done. But you can't see it, but I'm going through hundreds of pictures right now.
William, do you have another question?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Patrick. I just came back from Lisbon, and the thing that strikes you, and Seville, the thing that strikes you is the incredible destruction of Lisbon by the 1755 and the 1531 earthquakes. And much of the Moorish architecture of that time, except for the castle of St. George, was just wiped out. That was lower down the hill.
That's right.
But I see the Sierra Madre there, and I'm saying they've got to have had earthquakes in Alhambra, in Granada. So how did the Alhambra seem to stand?
Yeah. Okay. It's not as seismically active as the coast of Portugal, where Lisbon is, the old Roman Obelispo. That plate tectonic boundary of Iberia is pretty active right there where Lisbon is. But the 1755 earthquake also took out the city of Rabat in Morocco, and the great Torre, the Tower of the Sultans in Rabat. It's only standing a third of what it stood. So that earthquake was very active along plate tectonic boundaries, and Rabat is pretty close to the coast and that plate junction, whereas Granada, oddly enough, is not as seismically active on the north side of the Sierra Madres. But earthquakes have happened there. I mean, that one 1755 destroyed a lot of Iberian culture. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I'm going to stop share for a second, if I can, and then I'm going to go back again because I've got some of my photos.
You got it.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Can you see it's done first? This is the exact way that they did the tiles. Not so much the stucco, but the stucco could be done this way too. They would first pattern it out, and you see the guys drawing it out. Oh, by the way, that's the interior of Charles V's palace.
Wow.
It's not really Alhambra, but oh well. But look at this. Look at the guy doing it. You see, and he's stamping in this Tarsi marker. Do you see the lines? Can you see if I can make this larger? I'm not sure I can.
Yeah, I can see them actually. Yeah.
Wow.
Mm.
Oh man.
These are current craftspersons at the Alhambra, not in the palace, but on the sides. Basically public access. These people are still doing this. You see at the marquetry, and this is in wood. Some of this is even plastic, believe it or not. But if this gives you had that good question, Robert Neiden. This good question about how they do this. They have a template, but they first mark it out with ink or scratching, a stylus, or so the same way we know that this is. I've been in workshops in Spain. Also, I've also seen these people doing this. The workshops in Fez and Morocco, elsewhere, where this craft is still viable.
Impressive.
And this is from the Alhambra workshop.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
We were in Morocco and saw somebody doing a mosaic upside down.
Yeah, that's right.
He
The
couldn't
zealot
see it. He couldn't see the results until he was completely done and turned it over.
And they have to have a prodigious memory to know what the colors they're putting on are, unless they have a secret code that they put on the back of the tiles, which I didn't see. But yeah, I've been to some of these Zellige workshops in Morocco, especially in Fez, and you can see them doing it. And like that picture I showed you at the beginning of the guy cutting out the little pieces. But you can cut the pieces out, but you can also prefab them. You can make them according to whatever different pattern and then intersect them together after you've fired them and glazed them and fired them.
Right.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, this has been really fun for me and aesthetically really, really important. So thank you for letting me share a little bit of this wonderful, wonderful marvel of the world, the Alhambra, and all that it meant. And thankfully, it was not destroyed by the Reconquista.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. I suspect I went a little longer than I should have.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Not to worry. Thank you, Patrick. Great
welcome.
as usual.
Evelyn, thank you for inviting me. And Evelyn, maybe we'll see you together with us in Spain next year.
Oh, that'd be lovely. Well, thank you for coming. This was just great. Quick, tell us what continuing studies classes you're teaching.
Actual geographic trips.
Oh, okay, so I have 5 National Geographic expeditions in the next 3 months, so I'm working my classes around.
Oh, wow.
Because Stanford is only my 50%, my half-time employer, and National Geographic is my other. So starting right now, I've just started this week teaching uncensored Bible, what they couldn't teach you in Shabbat school, catechism, or Sunday school. So riot, and it can be quite contentious. And then I'm also teaching, starting in 2 weeks, the art of the Etruscans. That starts in 2 weeks. And then in the summer, I'm doing 10 discoveries that rewrote history, archaeological discoveries. And I'm also doing Roman art treasures. So two very short courses in July before I go back to the Alps for Net Geo.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Sarum Seminar. Thank you, Evelyn, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
À la prochaine. I can say à la prochaine, as we said in Morocco every day. À la prochaine, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Until next time, for sure.
Yeah,
Hi, everybody.
and God's will. Thank you. Bye-bye.